Look, it's been pretty warm on the east coast of Australia today, which has triggered the usual climate alarmist reporting from the usual suspects. I mean, ABC Radio News this morning was leading with the weather, a burst of summer warmth in mid-September, and they've talked up the bushfire threat and that horrible threat, of course, that we deal with every summer. Anyway, the Weather Bureau finally declared an El Nino weather pattern, which means we're in for one of those hotter and drier summers. And what that means is that our electricity grid is going to be tested, because that's when we get our peak electricity demand in Australia, of course, when everyone's got their air conditioning on. The irony and absurdity in this situation always does my head in. I mean, the reason we have such a fragile electricity grid with expensive and unreliable power and insufficient generation is because governments have been obsessed with reducing emissions. And that's all about global warming, of course. They want to pretend that they can change the climate, cool the planet, because it is only pretense. The science, the facts say that they can't, because Australia makes up only about 1% of global emissions and falling, and total global emissions are increasing. So the politicians have wrecked our electricity grid in a futile attempt to make the climate cooler. And now, when we desperately need electricity to keep cool in the summer, we face the prospect of days when we might not have enough electricity to meet demand. What genius! The conceit of them thinking they can change the climate and the incompetence of them creating energy chaos. All this is doubly insane when, of course, you consider the current government refuses to consider the one known proven technology to provide reliable and affordable energy without producing greenhouse gas emissions: nuclear energy.
I can't think of a worse fit for Australia than nuclear energy. It's extraordinarily expensive. We don't have a nuclear industry in Australia, so we'd be starting from scratch. There's no plan on what to do with the waste. It's very slow to build.
Now, this is a bizarre position, probably forced on Labor by the Greens and its own socialist left faction. It must be politics at play, of course, because the argument just does not stack up on economic, scientific, environmental or engineering grounds. In dozens of other countries, Bowen's arguments are disproved every day.
I just think if you look at a region like Ontario, they have 60% of nuclear power there, the new age nuclear power. It firms up renewables, and they're paying half the electricity bills that Victorians are or that Australians are. If Canada can do it, if France can do it, if the United States can do it, if the United Kingdom and elsewhere can do it, why can't Australia?
Encouragingly, as I mentioned last night, Labor seems to have dropped most of the old scares against nuclear. They don't run the environmental scares or the health scares anymore. Now, the focus from them is only on the cost, and their arguments just don't add up.
$387 billion would be the cost to replace the coal-fired power in Australia with nuclear. That's an enormous amount of money. It's $25,000 per taxpayer if the taxpayer funded it, or indeed, those proponents would need to know they get their money back and they get it back from Australian energy consumers.
Now, that total cost is wildly wrong. But most importantly, even as inflated as it is, it's a mere fraction of the $1,000 billion or more we'll spend on the untested renewables plus storage model.
The proposal being put forward by the government at the moment is costed at between $1.2 and $1.5 trillion. So if you think your electricity bill is expensive now, another 2 or 3 or 5 years down the track, you're going to be paying much more than what you're paying now.
Remember Labor's promise to cut your power bill by $275 a year? How does that look to you now? Anyway, as this nuclear debate played out on the ABC's Q&A last night, and by the way, that's a good sign. When I did my nuclear documentary here at Sky nearly 2 years ago, not enough people were talking about this option seriously enough, but now even the ABC raises nuclear as a plausible option. So anyway, on Q&A last night, Bowen gave us this aside.
I'm not being knocked over by nuclear energy investors. I'm not being knocked over by nuclear energy investors.
Really? He's not being knocked over by people wanting to invest their money in an illegal industry? What a surprise. The nuclear energy industry has been banned in this country since 1998. In a concession to the Greens, when the Howard government passed the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Act, which allowed for, of course, medical research, technology and the like, they added a ban on nuclear enrichment and fuel fabrication and power plants. It's a ban Labor stubbornly promises to keep in place. And on Q&A, the idiocy of this position was exposed by 17-year-old pro-nuclear campaigner Will Shackle.
This is the ban on nuclear energy. It's a single A4 piece of paper. And if the government was serious about reaching net zero and having a guaranteed path to net zero, well, they'd get rid of this. They'd get rid of this prohibition. And I think that is how you solve climate change, is having all options on the table. That's how you end the climate wars.
Indeed, well said, so well said. I got applause from the lefties in the ABC crowd. Typically, there's been plenty of online abuse for Shackle and the ABC for daring to air sensible debate on nuclear energy. Stick around for my interview with Will Shackle. He's the founder of Nuclear for Australia. I'll have him later in the program.